that some of you may resonate with. My mother was a single mom, got pregnant in high school. Obviously, got pregnant by my father, who I've only met 5 times. He's been long-term drug addicted. And while that's unfortunate in many ways, being able to find out about him over the course of my life has been instructive to my own ability to be a good father and soon to be a good husband. When I think about where we started in Jacksonville, Florida, actually in Jacksonville Beach in a little small town, and migrated to Delaware when I was 3. And my mother actually married my stepfather who raised me. I may have never finished the 11th grade, but was pretty incredible figure in my life. And when we got to Delaware, the interesting thing about my life was, regardless of the circumstances they came from, they knew that the key was education. And if I could just get education, it would unlock 2 things. Give me, quote unquote, a better life than they had, but also put on me a significant responsibility to serve others as I've been served, to bring others along, and to do that thoughtfully. And that's what has happened over the course of my life. Like you, Jason, I grew up in a pretty integrated neighborhood. It was fairly low income and actually more white than anything else. But that experience also really shaped me because it got me thinking about people who didn't look like me or come from places I come from very specifically. And instead of looking at our differences over time, particularly in our childhood, we found much more similarities over that time. Having said that, by the time I got to college, I really had my first, I would say, upfront racial encounter. I was at the University of Delaware and was taking a friend home and going back to my dorm, and 2 friends actually, and I was accosted by a university police officer for driving suspiciously. Now, for you folks on the phone, I had my dad's car, who had just recently passed at the time, was a red Le Mans with a white door. So it was not an attractive car by any stretch, but I certainly wasn't driving suspiciously. Soon after, the policeman asked me a couple of questions about if I was a university student and where I was going, et cetera. He didn't really like my answers, so I spent a night in jail. And that particular moment was instructive to me just about the realities of what you were up against as a person of color, particularly an African-American male in civil society. Having said that, there have been so many things that have happened to me that have shaped my professional career in that regard. And I won't go into all of it, but to have had the opportunities to work in the private sector, start a couple of organizations, work for Senator Joe Biden, and now be the president of Delaware State University, is pretty amazing. But I need folks to know that that doesn't just happen to everybody. The road, particularly for economically disadvantaged African-American men and women, can be long and tough, and in many circumstances usually are. And there are usually many pitfalls that don't let folks like me get to some of the accomplishments I've been able to achieve. I say that to say, when you see the only Black man or the only Black woman or the only Latino woman or Latino man in the room where you are doing business, recognize that their journey may be a much different one than you may have experienced. And then try to be authentic with them and get to know what that experience is, where the similarities are, and as my mother told me, how I can go back and help more folks along.
Tony, we'll get to implicit bias, a little later in the conversation, but first I want to ask you, growing up in a predominantly white space, and I'm talking about 1, Jacksonville, Florida, and then 2, your experience at the University of Delaware, how do you think that affected you personally, whether it was on a subconscious basis? And, how do you think it affected, the white people around you? And how do you think they treated you, given that you were probably one of the only people of color who they would interact with that particular day, or see in a classroom over their 4 years, or growing up in their public school? How did that affect you, and how do you think it affected them?
From my perspective, it depends on my time in the life cycle, but I can tell you that Sometimes I was very comfortable. More times than often I was very comfortable, and quite frankly was able to assimilate, which kind of forced me to give up some of my identity to fit in. And other times it was right in your face. And that moment at the University of Delaware was one such time. I don't know how many people know University of Delaware, but even today it's only 3% students of color, and it's about 20,000 students. So you could literally walk across the campus and not see somebody that looked like you the entire day. So those kinds of experiences, to your point, really do shape you. And I suspect, and this is a suspicion that I believe I've found some validation around, it allows white folks, regardless of their intention, to check the box around having known and been close with an African American. And that can be dangerous. It can be dangerous for a couple of reasons. For the African American, to my point, it could make you get a little comfortable, right? Like you're okay being the only one. And to the white ally, it could really skew your perception of Black people, particularly when you see all the systemic inequities that have shaped race in America. Right? So you see a lot of Black on Black violence or images on TV that are not always representative of the entire Black community, and then you see a Jason sitting next to you in the boardroom, and you think, well, Jason did it. Why can't all of them do it? It's much deeper than that, to your point around implicit bias and systemic inequities. And I think this past 6 months has really allowed us to focus a little bit more clearly on what those systemic inequities mean and how they play themselves out across all of our spaces. And for those who really want to do something about it, how they even begin that conversation.
Well, you walked me right into my next question. You mentioned implicit bias. For those of the people in this chat who don't really know exactly what that means, can you explain it to them, especially being an educator? And, once you get into the explanation of what it is, maybe try to explain how we can check that and be a little more conscious of it, and just, explain the damage that it can do on perception and reality.
So Jason, it's so you hit on it. It's a subconscious behavior. So most folks don't believe that they are prejudiced or have bias, regardless of where they come from or what their experience is. But we are shaped around in the context of the world around us. So as images and stereotypes get played over the course of history, and I always think about the broad course of history, so not the last 50 years or the last 100 years, 400 years. Many of those years being times when literally African Americans were, by law, less than 3/5 of a man. And then the split for another 130 years, where there was this separation that for some reason, the African American needed to go to this water fountain or this bathroom, and the white person needed to go to another one. And then the schooling that happened as a result of that. And then the fact that we really didn't get civil rights laws that were in favor of us until the 60s. I was born in 1970. So just think about how that contextually shapes framing, right? It reduces the opportunities for African Americans and other minorities. It limits our ability to connect and have those opportunities be open to us in a way that we can get the proper schooling, make the next step after our academic career, build capacity for our families and the like. It reduces our ability to have really financial assets we can pass on from generation to generation. All those things contextually can have you think that a person or a group of people are a certain way effectively by their own doing. But the reality is that there is a broader systemic reality that we all have to be really very, very sensitive to. And I think to your point about combating that kind of thing, first of all, it's hard because you got to be conscious about it, and intentional, right? So the one way to be intentional about that is talking to others that don't have your same experience, that don't come from your same background, and being prepared for the tough answers. I found that even among my closest white friends, before the murder of George Floyd, having those kind of conversations was a little prickly. It was a little prickly. And my belief is that the COVID-19 pandemic exposed this other pandemic that has been going on for centuries now. And we all couldn't turn away because we were all stuck at home. So now is the perfect time for an organization like Common Bonds to start having these conversations with the willing. And what I hope is on the call tonight is a broad group of the willing who are at least open to having the conversation.
Right. Now, you explained that one instance when you were at the University of Delaware with the police officer. Have there been any other instances, whether it was blatant, right in your face, or, maybe an effect of implicit bias where you experienced racism in the corporate world where maybe, a white person didn't even realize they were being racist, or just were so unaware that was affecting you personally because you're a Black man? Has there been any instances where you can give examples to maybe put in context something that people might not realize happens on an everyday basis?
I got two answers to that. The first is to the point about law enforcement. So I've had at least 3 other opportunity or experiences with law enforcement that were particularly damaging. I won't go into them, but just know that those things exist. And I know you know this. I have 3 sons. I've had to have the talk with them, how they are to behave if an officer stops them, what 10 and 2 means, how to be careful with respect to not going for the glove box too fast for your license and registration. All those things are the experience, I would argue, of every Black man and Black boy in the country. So I'll leave that to the side. In corporate America, because I think that's really important, I was head of communications for a couple of our bigger businesses, the consumer bank, the commercial bank, a couple of acquisitions, et cetera. And that forces you to have sort of a broad sense of the company and how it operates. And while I made great progress at that company, I can tell you that when there were Black issues that surfaced around us, whether there were certain organizations that were saying we were not as fair or equal, or when we were promoting things that were more connected to the African American experience, they always went to me and a few others first. And while people might say, well, shouldn't they? Actually, to have those kind of experiences, to think through who you want to be as a company, is a little bit more than going to the Black people for their perspective. If you know us, you know the kind of things we want, need, and think can represent a company well. What you got to be sensitive to is how you are in that process, how you see yourself in that process. And usually, Jason, as you know, in any company, they have values, and those values usually have something to do with being inclusive. It's really about living your values. Living your values is not always depending on the Black man in the room or the Latino in the room or the African American woman in the room. It's really about what is my responsibility. So those are what you call small daggers that folks feel like probably don't do any harm. They're probably the right thing to ask the question, right? But are really just, I'm going to relegate you to this particular area, right, because of the race, which on some level says, oh, all Black people think the same. So let me just ask Tony because he's a representative of the entire population. So you can see how that can naturally be offensive on any number of levels.
Yeah, no, 100%. Now, another one of our key topics this month for Common Bonds is color blindness. And you hear a lot of times, hey, I don't see color. I was raised just to see the inside and not really acknowledge, different races. And people say that as a way to saying, I treat everyone equally. It's usually well-intentioned, but it's not all, it can be very problematic, having that frame of belief. Can you explain why, the whole color blindness theory is actually damaging?
Well, let me say, many of those theories, as you know, Jason, those are theories that get folks comfortable, right?
Yeah.
The reality is you can't have equality if you don't have equity, right? So in the The basic definition of those two things are equal, means you're starting at the same exact place with no disadvantages to where you begin. Equity recognizes that people start in different places, and some of that has to do with the context and system I talked about. So if you believe in equity, and you believe in that, if you were a low-income white person going up against somebody who inherited all their money that happened to be white, right? So it's not always race. But when you think about contextually what that means for us, if you believe in equity, and you can't believe in color blindness. That's the whole notion in our society, in the American context, is that there's been so much historic inequity that is disproportionately affecting Black and brown communities throughout the country, that equity connects directly to recognizing and seeing people for who they are and for the experiences that have been put upon them by the broader system. I always like to say, I defy any of my white brothers and sisters to find a social determinant statistic in the American context that is damaging to any person, that doesn't disproportionately affect people of color more than any other racial group. That should tell you in and of itself a lot of what we're talking about today.
Right. Now, before I get to what you do in your role as a president when it comes to race, I want to ask you, what made you transition from corporate America, a very successful corporate career, into education?
You know, it's funny. My mother, first of all, always said, Tony, you're really a teacher. We're waiting for you to get back to that. And my retort always was, Mom, I'm always out here trying, whatever environment or industry I'm in, I'm always trying to give back. But she knew that my heart was in a different place. And I can tell you with Delaware State's experience, I came here chasing it. I've been chasing Delaware State, trying to get here for about 10 years. And that had nothing to do with my time in the private sector. In fact, my time at Bank of America was one of the richest times in my life, and I think helped develop me for the role I'm in today. But there was a calling, a yearning, and you had to match that yearning against real things, right? So your yearly bonus, which I know folks think about, right? The context you might find yourself in an organization with lower resources, and juxtapose that against what's in your heart. And my mother would always tell me, if you always make the decision that's connected to your heart, the other things will take care of itself. And when I started doing that, I really found much more value in what I was doing, and was able to connect the dots through all of my life, whether that was at Bank of America or the league before that, or my time with then Senator Biden. So it has really been a fascinating journey for me. But as the president of Delaware State University, I'm going to meet future bankers. I'm going to mold future nonprofit executives. I'm going to know people who want to work in government. And I have all those different experiences to help shape their minds so they can not only be exceptional professionals, but exceptional citizens.
Right. Now, again, walk me into my next question. You're molding a lot of these, young scholars at Delaware State University. How will you mold them and teach them and guide them to address racism that they may face, as they go out into the corporate world or whatever career path they take?
I feel great about that, actually. And there are always opportunities in crisis. And I think what we have seen over this last 6 months is a lot of folks, particularly in corporate America, who are authentic and oftentimes happen to be white allies, who are authentic to trying to get this right. So it's really up to us, places like Delaware State University and other HBCUs, to present the right template for getting it right. And my sense is you have to bring those folks early in the process. So just give you an example, oftentimes when people are thinking about internships for folks at colleges and universities, they're always thinking of juniors and seniors, right? We just did a nice deal with Bank of America, actually. We're going to actually bring them into the pipeline early. right? We have an early college high school, so we actually have some 9th and 10th graders, 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th graders, and we have our regular college population. So imagine what it means for some executives to show up at our high school and then begin spending significant time right through those students' matriculation through college. Then think about what that means as you get more Black executives coming back, giving back in that same manner. So somebody always told me you can't be what you can't see. So we spend time developing those kinds of connections in a deliberate way, and I believe it's going to extend itself. Relative to racism in particular, as you know, many of our students come from vulnerable populations and vulnerable communities. And I can tell you that the things that they witnessed over this past 6 months have inspired them in a substantive way. I met with my Student Government Association over the summer. They had 3 things for me. This is the newly minted student group. They said, Mr. President, we want an ongoing dialogue with the law enforcement at the university. And the reason they said that is because, look, we understand that things in our homes, in our communities, are not always great between law enforcement and our community, and we want to be a model here at the university. Second, they said you need to divest from Chick-fil-A, which was an interesting kind of desire. But what they said is we don't like their stance on civil rights and LGBTQ issues, which I thought was interesting that they had done that much research and were trying to make the connection. And the last thing they said was we need an ongoing presence and commitment around Black Lives Matter, and we'll be the ones to create those opportunities for you. And to all of that, I mean, there were some things we had to navigate and are still navigating, but to all of that, I said, think about how bad it must have been for them to be so inspired, that they would come back to their HBCU, a place they call home, and have some demands of the HBCU. That says everything you need to know about our ability to really connect with them, be there for them, and really hear them in a way that I don't think we had heard them in many years.
Perfect. So, like I said earlier, Common Bonds, we're all about educating, and obviously you're an educator. Last week when we spoke, you mentioned how you got an influx of people reaching out to you, mostly white people, obviously, immediately after the George Floyd incident. Mm-hmm. And you're like, hey, Tony, what can we do to help? And, how can we get past this thing we call racism, this, that, and the third? And, when someone reaches out to you in that manner, it comes from a good place, What is your response to that? How do you respond when someone asks? I know you mentioned at one level, it's almost, for lack of a better word, annoying, because it's like, this has been happening. Like George Floyd wasn't the first time this happened, and we've known this our whole life. So it's like the ignorance, and when I say ignorance, I mean that by the actual definition, the ignorance to like now you're reaching out can kind of irk you. But at the same time, you do know it's a good place. And like you said, you have really great white allies in your life who want to help. What's your response to those people? Because I'm sure there's people in the audience, maybe they didn't do that, but they probably think it. What can I do to help?
Well, the first thing is to listen, because there are some folks that are checking that box. This is awful. We're in the middle of a pandemic. We saw what just happened to George Floyd. I know Tony or Jason, let me give them a call and let me know I'm thinking about them. And I had a lot of that. And there were a few people, and I do mean a couple of people, 2 of which you guys will hear from next month, that kept calling. And when they kept calling, they started asking things around what they should do. And I started giving them reading material. Things like The Souls of Black Folk, which is written by one of the great Black scholars of the 20th century, W.E. Du Bois, as you know. Books like Black Wealth, White Wealth, written by 2 scholars, Mel Oliver and Tom Shapiro. And just trying to give them broader context. And then you see if they come back and those folks still kept coming back. And then they thought, not only they're going through this awakening for themselves, they wanted to make sure that companies, and you can imagine all the companies had something to say and put up resources around racial equity and economic opportunity. But those folks that kept coming back were really got involved in the process, which has led to some very unique, never before done, at least at Delaware State University, partnerships that we believe will have significant merit for our students going forward. And then the last thing I'd say is I've had a university forum every week since the pandemic. So since March 12th or so, every Tuesday at 11, I've had a forum. And usually that was about giving updates about the pandemic itself. But since that time, we've had forums on voting, forums on racial unrest, forums on civic engagement. And that has really set a standard. So you can not only hear from me, you can join my forum every Tuesday and hopefully get something that we believe can advance the ball down the field. Because if a Black institution like Delaware State University and other HBCUs aren't the leaders at this moment, then we're not really doing our job. And our job is to connect different worlds in a substantive way so you can really build pipelines that look like the America we're becoming.
Right. Now, in terms of individual racism and, you know, how our white allies can help in that sense, you know, we've talked about the subconscious, obviously, the subconscious bias that we all possess. When it's a little more blatant and, you know, we all might have family members, for instance, who are of a certain belief, and you know they don't know how to kind of approach that. What would you advise them to do in those type of situations? Because I get that same thing too. Well, I have this cousin, or I have this uncle, or my people believe in this. How would you address that if you were in their shoes, I guess, if they ask you that?
Yeah, if racial equity, economic opportunity are a personal value of yours, regardless of who's around you, how close they are to you, whether they're family or your best friend, you got to have standards for interaction. In my view, you can't accept what a crazy uncle at Thanksgiving is going to say if that's what you truly value. It's actually a good measure, because I do know that, and even in my own life, on the other side, I do know that in my own family, among closer friends, they might be more free to say things they think they can say in closed company that they wouldn't say in a more public venue. So what is my responsibility in that moment? My responsibility is to say, at least when we are interacting, when we are together, here are my values for interaction. If you don't subscribe to those, then we can't be together. And I think that may sound tough, but how many people, and many of my white friends have told me they have a very racist member of their family. So you know what I normally think is, well, that means you probably have 2 or 3 of them. It's not about tolerating them and just saying, oh, that's crazy Uncle Joe, right? It's really about saying, here is my standard for love and interaction of all people. And if you can't accept that standard, then we have to remove ourselves from each other or find a way to have a real authentic conversation. Because you can't accept that and then go back to your Black friends who you're trying to be authentic with, knowing you've accepted something that obviously they would be completely offended by and probably hurt by because of the fact that you accepted it in the first place.
Right. Yeah, that's where it comes to the difficult conversations. They're not always easy, but they definitely progress us more. Now, I've seen a lot of questions pop up, so I'll get to that in a second. But Tony, just one final thing, I want to kind of give you the floor to, you know, express your final thoughts with everyone who tapped in to join us and hear what you had to say. And I guess in the same token, while you do that, can you tell us what initially interested you with Common Bonds and made you want to be, you know, a part of this whole process that we've started over the last couple of months?
Well, you know, Jason, like I said, there were a lot of white friends, some of which I hadn't spoken to in a long time, some of which were of significant consequence to me, 2 of which have continued to go through their own journey in this most recent context. And then Mike Candido came along. And I can tell you that Mike and I knew each other fairly casually. We were kind of reintroduced by a mutual friend, and he began having the same conversation with me that I was having with those other two colleagues. And I heard him, listened intently, said I'm happy to be helpful, and then he kept coming back. And I always know that if they keep coming back, there's a certain desire, a real personal interest in wanting to do more than check a box. So when I started hearing about common bonds, you and April, some of the first people's names that came up, I heard your story before you told me your story. That resonated with me personally. And then what mostly interested me was very interested in making sure that white brothers and sisters who wanted to take the first step toward a conversation were going to be an initial focus. And I knew that, because as you know, all day we can have conversations with ourselves, right? The choir. But those folks who were thinking about how or if are really the folks that we need to spend some time with and make sure that we are being authentic and allowing ourselves to hear their backgrounds and experience. And I think that is pretty much what Common Bonds is all about. And I think it's making a big difference already on that score.
Awesome. Thank you. Now let's get to some questions. We have about 20 minutes left. We have some great questions in, and if you have one, don't be shy. We can get to it. Just enter it in the chat feature. We'll start with Hank Weaver. Thank you, Tony, for your time. As a white man, I've never been asked to represent the white perspective. How do you manage that incremental pressure, and what can white allies do to help share or reduce that burden?
There are a couple things. One, and I would, for me, it's not incremental pressure, it's just annoying. So that kind of annoyance factor can come up. I remember we were doing a great thing. We actually replayed the Martin Luther King speech for the 50th anniversary of the speech, and all of me and my peers came into a room, and I was pretty excited about what was happening and how we were going to do it. And I actually was very proactive in trying to give some perspective then, so much so that my boss said, okay, Tony, we got it. We got it, enough is enough. And even that was, again, a little small dagger when I was trying to, actually acquiesce to what I thought they wanted to hear. So what I tell you is, if you're really an ally, when I say white ally, I'm doing that very intentionally. If you're really an ally, that means you step up in those moments of truth. There's no reason you shouldn't be as knowledgeable or working to be as knowledgeable about the Black American story as I am about the white American story. And if you're able to do that, then you can speak up in those moments of truth and reduce those burdens. So it's not really about saying I'm sorry or lamenting why that always happens to your great Black friend. It's more about you getting your own learning and being able to speak up in those moments as well.
Yeah, it definitely takes some added effort, some work, and sometimes it's easy to put that off. But, like Tony said, to be an actual ally, it does require a little extra effort, Now we're at Wayne Gibbs. Besides social and news media, what are effective ways to spread stories of allyship like that of Mike and April? Can we get outside of the high-tech box a little?
I actually think that, and COVID has prevented us from doing things in person, but I actually think that moments like this are the best. And it doesn't always have to be forums, right? I'm sure most people on this call have folks in their life that don't have their same racial background or ethnicity, don't come from the same place they come. Have a happy hour, a Zoom happy hour, and just have a conversation that's a little bit more clear as to the issues that you are concerned about. You'll be pleased and I believe surprised as to what you'll hear back. It's not often that the perspective of African Americans relative to the behavior/attitudes of white brothers and sisters comes in the context of white brothers and sisters asking that question. So why not ask the question? I remember having a very long conversation with one of the two men I was talking to you about the talk. He literally said, I didn't even know what the talk was, Tony. You mean you have to have a talk with your sons about how to interact with law enforcement folks just because they get stopped for speeding or something like that? I said, yeah. And I would imagine if you asked most black men around it, they would tell you the same thing. And just that little thing has, particularly in that person, has inspired him so much that you can see the awakening coming before him. And like I said, you know that to be true because they keep coming back. And quite frankly, it gives you an opportunity, because it's not one way either way. It gives me an opportunity to share with him some of my concerns. You know, I think a lot about, I don't know if you guys ever heard this thing, but I think a lot about imposter syndrome. Do I actually deserve the things that I'm getting? Am I the one that's supposed to be in the room? Why me? Those kind of things are very resonant, and I'm particularly resonant for young black professionals who are trying to find their way in the world as well. So once you start having those real conversations, real meaningful conversations, you will see the common bonds that naturally exist.
Nice. Next one, Caitlin Turtletop. Hi, Tony. Thanks for your time again this week. I work for a startup tech company with majority white leadership. We have recently created a DE&I team. I assume that stands for Diversity, Equality, and Inclusion team, which I'm a part of. What are things you would recommend to someone in my shoes to share with my leadership and help promote or influence diversity initiatives?
I'm only going to respond. I think that's a great question. I'm only going to respond with one thing, and it's an old quote from the first private company I worked for, a place called MBNA. Used to say, "What gets measured gets attended to. What gets attended to gets done." So I'm a fan of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Councils. I actually chaired one at Bank of America and was proud of what we were able to accomplish. But the real value here is, what are you measuring relative to why you created the council? The obvious facts should be notable, particularly as it relates to talent pipelining and how you interact with your diverse talent pipeline inside the company, how you build that pipeline outside the company, and what you do for the customers and clients you serve that usually look like a more diverse America. But if you do not measure against those things, then all you're doing is having a council. So if you can make it a part of your bottom line, which is connected to your values, then you can actually see some real movement. The last 3 years, my time at Bank of America, I developed a discipline called corporate reputation, and it was really about this notion of change. You know, we were very connected to the financial crisis. So we wanted to know, do our customers and clients think we changed? Here were the 3 things they said. We know you've changed if you actually do what you say you can do. That's just a matter of customer service and expertise. For me, that's table stakes. Second, we don't give you any credit for your philanthropy, but if you can use that expertise for social good, for dealing with the country's most pressing problems, that's what we want to have happen. And in the bank's case, some of those problems could be the lack of capital for minority and women-owned businesses. And the last factor was, do you look like the customers and clients you serve up and down the company? And I think I said this last week, but many, and particularly in big companies, oftentimes you can see a lot of diversity at the bottom, but as you go up, the funnel gets closer and closer, and all of a sudden, it's much more of a homogenous leadership. So I'd say if you're able to measure those things that you're after and understand what change looks like, that's a real way to start a diversity, equity, and inclusion council.
Great stuff. Pamela Peace. We are seeing many corporations throwing a considerable amount of funds and resources towards HBCUs. As the president of Delaware State, what are you saying to those corporations about what your school and other HBCUs needs and how to sustain that commitment?
Well, one, just from sustainment, we're actually for multi-year commitments as opposed to a one and done. We've had some one and done, quite frankly. But in those instances, we've been very clear about, again, the systemic inequities that HBCUs face both versus our PWI counterparts. So I'm going to give you one factor on this point. So HBCUs have one eighth the endowment of predominantly white institutions and colleges and higher ed. 1/8. So when something like a pandemic happens and many other PWIs can dip into very large endowments, we just don't have those resources. So it becomes very important that we have unrestricted capital used proactively and thoughtfully. The other thing I'd say is our capacity is really about making sure that we can get young Black talent through the pipeline and get them to graduate and placement. And the way you're able to do that, as I said earlier, is to find those corporations who actually believe in that and want to be with you along the journey. Not at a career fair every year, right? Not at the time where it's their senior year and you're looking for those 1 or 2 Black people to check the box. This is about having a relationship throughout college matriculation that not only deals with those students, but also deals with curriculum. So the instruction reflects what they'll hope to experience when they get to the job market. And I can tell you that those conversations are actually happening in a way that I have not seen in a very long time. And I believe will have material effect on the job opportunities that ultimately will exist for talented people of color.
Cool, and here's another one from Pamela Peace. Have you found an effective tool or training to guide folks through those uncomfortable conversations?
I wouldn't say a tool. I would say though people. There's one person I'll give you, and if I can get his number before we leave, I'll put it in the chat. But Marvin Worthy is a trainer like no other in my view. He actually does diversity training for me here at the university, but I've spent time with him in any number of industries. And you do need somebody sometimes to help guide uncomfortable conversations and give you the tools to use them once they leave. And he's probably, not probably, for me, he's the best in the business. I'll make sure I give you his number before we leave.
All righty, and here's one from Maura McKenna. Hi, Dr. Allen. Thank you for giving your time and sharing your experience and knowledge tonight. I'm wondering if you could speak to the environment and culture that HBCUs establish. Looking at the higher graduation rates, job rates, and higher graduate earnings, it makes it clear that our schools specifically need to rethink how we are teaching and meeting the needs of the community. That the problem is the institutions, not the students we serve. What are some things teachers, administrators in elementary, middle school, and high school should prioritize that could help create a similar successful environment?
That's a very good question. Let me tell you how our students come to us. There are a couple of things you should be very sensitive to. One, it's all of our students are economically disadvantaged, but a significant proportion are. Many of them, a higher propensity, are first-generation college students. They haven't necessarily had the experience close in of what college looks and feels like. And I say all of them need wraparound services, which is to say that outside of the classroom, their mental, physical capacity, how we are able to understand their needs in a responsible way are very important to their survival. There's one statistic called first-year retention. If you can make a freshman a sophomore, there's a much higher propensity for them to actually matriculate and graduate from college. The best way to think about those contextual things is at the K-12 level as well. So what I have found, and I've done a lot of K-12 reform work as well, is that the teachers are pretty focused on their primary responsibility, which is to try to instruct, right? But if a student is coming to the classroom hungry or has seen any number of violent moments or things happening in the communities that they just came from, or has other disabilities that have not been diagnosed, it's going to make two things very impossible. One, impossible for that child to learn, and two, impossible for that teacher to instruct them in any capable fashion. So we have to build capacity for the wraparound services, the supports we know will help them in their success. And just to give you some context, most well-funded schools, whether they be private or public, have those wraparound supports. So don't think that is just connected to low-income schools in Black or brown communities. What I am asking for, again, is equity, right? The same kind of services you might get at a well-funded private or well-funded public, you have to be able to provide in those lower resource institutions. And the same is true at Delaware State University and many other HBCUs, which is why we're very committed. The last thing I'd say, Jason, which I think is important, is just think, and I think this is why we've been able to bring our students back successfully this semester. Most of our students, they want the college experience, but they're literally coming to change the economic trajectory for themselves, their families, and their communities. That's a dual purpose when they're getting to college. So when they're here, they're trying their very best to oftentimes be the first and be able to represent something much more meaningful for generations to come of their families and their communities they call home.
Great, and great question, Maura. So that's about it with the questions. Now I'll bring in our co-founder, Mike DiCandido, for some final words and thoughts.
Yep, great. Thanks, Jason. And thanks, Tony. I appreciate everyone's time. And, we started Common Bonds, as April mentioned, and I think it was our collective frustration at what was going on in society and how we could drive change and drive it from both a African-American perspective and a white perspective. And, one of the unique things we've tried to do with Common Bonds is bring personal stories and experiences. So I really want to thank Dr. Tony Allen, Tony, for not only last week, but this week, and just his openness to sharing personal stories and talking to us in a very close environment here today. We try to keep these sessions small so we can have a lot of interaction, and we appreciate the questions. But Tony, really appreciate it, and we're hoping that you'll be an advocate for us in the future, and we certainly will be an advocate for you, and looking forward to growing the partnership we have with Delaware State and the wonderful job that you've done there. I want to thank Jason for the wonderful job of facilitating the session, and I certainly want to thank all of you for attending. It's wonderful to see some faces I haven't seen in a while, so hello. And it's wonderful to see new folks as well, and in particular, for our African-American friends on the phone, one of the educational pieces for me has been how draining it is to teach, and how Tony has mentioned and Jason has mentioned to me and others that as white allies come and ask questions and for advisement, how draining it really is for African Americans to have to say, it's been 400 years. Why can't we just be, for us to have to educate you to treat people the right way? And so, for me, that was really eye-opening, and wanted to thank all of you for offering and being patient with us and educating us from a white perspective. And I want to thank the white allies that are on the phone. My adage has been really three things: to learn, to listen, to learn, and to lead. And what we really need here is for whites to help lead the initiatives that we need to do in order to eliminate racial inequity and no longer rely on the folks who've been victimized with it for hundreds of years to be the leaders in moving us away from it. It's no longer the responsibility solely of African Americans. It never should have been. And that's my passion around taking the lead for equity for everyone. So thank you all for attending. Just a couple of plugs. George Spencer is going to be speaking on Thursday. If you weren't with us last Thursday, George spoke, and very similar to Tony, was a wonderful speaker telling us of his personal experiences. He is the Chief Development Officer for the Thurgood Marshall Fund, so has a lot of insight to offer. Follow us at Common Bonds, go on our website, sign up for the monthly newsletter. This month, as Jason mentioned, we focused on individual racism, in particular implicit bias and colorblindness. Next month, we're going to focus on interpersonal relationship and microaggression. We've got a couple of wonderful folks who are going to join us in a similar format and speak. I'm not going to tell you who they are. We'll announce it on the website next week. But we really appreciate the support. I would ask you just to share with others, follow us on social media. Our ultimate goal right now is allyship. It's getting the word out. It's spreading our wings so we can educate as many people as possible for what we're trying to do. So With that, really appreciate the questions and the dialogue. Tony, again, thank you so much. Congratulations again on your engagement, which Tony announced to us last week. So we were the first group to know. So that's wonderful. And thank you all for taking some time tonight. And we look forward to seeing many of you on Thursday if you can make it 6 o'clock. And keep an eye out on the website again for next month's sessions, which will be, I think, equally educational and intriguing for folks. So we appreciate you joining us. Thanks and have a great night.
Stay safe, guys.
Thanks, guys.